souls who are going to listen to this. Some of you listening to this, again, thank you. It's taken a lifetime to actually be able to give this talk. So why now? Why this topic? Why now? And there is, next slide, please. There is, will be a quote that's about 60 years apart that kind of sets the tone for why this, why now. Unity happens only when we actively seek it. It does not happen by osmosis. You do not trip into it. Grace is free, but everything else costs in the kingdom, and that cost can be tremendous. Seeking after unity means we have to be willing to have those uncomfortable conversations and put ourselves in those uncomfortable positions outside of our comfort zone so that we can see the other point of view, but also the whole truth as well. And most importantly, we have to be willing to embrace pain. So my point from this discussion today, or my points are three: to help the body come to grips with our own truth so we can overcome the gaps that the past has created. To recruit more lovers of Christ who want to see this thing dealt with and sozoed right out of the body in America, and sozo is just the Greek word for healed, saved, and delivered, and to begin the dialogue, because we really haven't nationally, maybe not since Martin Luther King, have we had a honest and real discussion on this. And so, next slide. I wanted to set the stage of just church in America, why it is so different from the rest of expressions of Christianity in the world. And a German professor out of the University of Mainz kind of coined these couple of points as key differentiator to the expression of Christianity in America: the impulse towards separatism, the division between church and state, immigration, the westward movement, slavery, and the revival movement. And while ethnic tensions tend to be, unfortunately, too normal in other regions of the world, its expression in America is unique. Forms of racial division within the same forms of Christianity just seem to not have a counterpart in any other region in the world. Why is this? We're just going to then dive into the roots of the American church. One more slide as well. Excellent. And those roots are in the English Reformation. And it wasn't the Reformation of Martin Luther, but rather that of Henry VIII. He needed a divorce. Catherine of Aragon was not producing him an heir, and he also wanted to get out of Spain's thumb that had a lot of, underneath of Spain's thumb, that had a lot of influence in Rome with the Pope. And so in 1532, there was an act of Parliament that made him the head of the Church of England, and he was already the head of the state of England as well. And so you can see where we in the U.S. began to want to dismantle that. Of course, this resulted in disputes separating from the Catholic Church, among other things, that ended in the English Civil Wars that lasted more than 100 years. And basically, England flip-flopped between Protestantism and Catholicism during that period, any time between Henry VIII and William and Mary. And those disagreements range from what should be in the prayer book to how deep Reformation should actually go. And they were violent. These were wars. And what resulted from this, what emerged from all of this turmoil, was the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, and a few nonconformist factions that came out of that. Presbyterian and Episcopalianism were the main ones, and they were still really affiliated with the Anglican Church, and they were on very good terms with the Anglican Church. But then you had the outsiders: Puritanism, Methodism, Quakerism, Baptist movements come from that. Next slide. This then gets exported to the Episcopalians and Presbyterians. First really entered the New World, the East Coast of the New World, with the Gospels. Both, again, factions within the Anglican Church that made a conscious decision to not proselytize to the African slave or to the Native American. They felt it would dismantle the institution of slavery, naturally, and they used Scripture to support the decision. They believed Christianity made a worse slave because, of course, whom the Son sets free is truly free indeed. But they also doubted the humanity of Africans and Native Americans, whether there was even a soul there to be saved. So by 1706, laws were put in place to ensure that baptism did not change the condition of slaves in 6 of the colonies. And this takes us to colonial America. By the turn of the 18th century, England solidifies or codifies really the slave system and enlists the church to actually enforce it. Any ambiguities associated with both the legality of slavery and its restrictions to blacks were resolved by 1680. And at the same time, the Church of England began to really establish like a normal life in general for the southern colonies in particular. It kept Protestant dissenters and what they would call the threat of gospel liberty, e.g. the Methodists and the Baptists and the Puritans and the Quakers, out of the fray from getting a real foothold into the middle of the 18th century. And it also made clear that the efforts to convert slaves and incorporate them into the churches would be undertaken without questioning the institution of slavery. And of course, the inevitable result is we have an Anglicanism that basically props up and validates, legitimizes the slave system. Or in short, very few conversions of the African slave as a result. Next slide. During the Revolutionary period, things start to change a little bit. Both the Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards, and the American Revolution began to prick the conscience of some believers. And we have a quote here. Jonathan Edwards followers like Samuel Hopkins and other abolitionists really became quite vocal during the early years or early decades of this nation. At least a few Christians sensed a great hypocrisy. How was it that so much moral indignation could flow against Britain for the threat of slavery, ostensibly implied by parliamentary actions, often misguided, even stupid, but rarely malicious, when white Americans calmly continued to enslave hundreds of thousands of black Africans? And so the subject of slavery became a major discussion at the Continental and New Congress and was even part of the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. You can Google it. Thomas Jefferson had a few paragraphs just basically blaming the British Crown for introducing the institution of slavery. He predicts the Civil War, that it's going to tear the young nation up, and that was yet another reason why we should separate from the Crown. Of course, that was struck by the southern colonies, who were very wealthy and depended upon slave labor to maintain that wealth, and we needed that wealth as a nation to fund the revolution and the young nation. So it won out. And that quote I gave you was from A History of Christianity in the U.S. and Canada by Mark Knoll. But at the same time, church authority structures changed in America. As we declared our independence, so did our churches. The Episcopalian and Presbyterians threw off their headship in England and began to set up their own leadership here in the colonies. And then the Baptists and Methodists of England, who weren't faring too well in England, saw this as an opportunity to have impact in the New World. And they came and focused on proselytizing to the African and the Native American. And in the beginning, egalitarian ideas prevailed, but was crushed by the wills of slavery because the economics of this young nation at that time was desperately dependent on it. Yes, between the Revolutionary and Civil Wars, we had the institution of slavery, I'm saying in quotes, winning out. There were Methodist and Baptist revival-focused evangelicalism that appealed to white women and blacks that, saw unity trying to spark within the body of Christ in America. But the establishment, of course, terrified, hit the roof over that, and so began to really impress upon segregation to be the norm within the church again. And so blacks broke off and started their own denominations, yet again, more factionalism. And the African Methodist Episcopal Church is the first one to do so. But there was also regional splits of believers in America as well, North and South, over the subject of abolition versus slavery. Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians all basically had regional splits between 1840s and 1860s. So this takes us to an unusual result despite best efforts, where we find slavery actually flourishing on the plantations, despite every effort for it to not flourish. From the start, however, the message the whites thought they were conveying was not what the blacks were hearing. A historian, Albert Rubateau, has put it, the meaning which the missionary wished the slaves to receive and the meaning which the slaves actually found or better made were not the same, meaning that they actually heard the inaccuracy of the slaves' translation of Christianity would be cause of concern for missionaries for a long time to come. For the slaves themselves, that inaccuracy became a source of unanticipated hope. When they found, for example, that the Bible had more to say about Jesus lifting burdens than slaves obeying masters, blacks discovered a secret their masters did not want them to know. And that's, again, from a history of Christianity in the U.S. and Canada. And so slaves began defying their masters to meet in secret, oftentimes driven by the desire to worship in freedom the way they wanted to worship. There was always this persistent refusal to let someone else define their faith and what they believed for them. And there was this boldness rooted in the belief that God will give them justice in the end. And Judgment Day is still quite key in the it's an extremely important concept in the African American church. And this just brings us to a demonstration in America of the power of the gospel. It's something that was originally intended, or used, I should say, to validate and support the concept and institution of slavery becomes the very tool that actually dismantled it. It could be a source of comfort, reconciling slaves to their fate and bondage, but it also could feed rebellion. In some form or other, whether through redemptive images from the Bible or Christian patterns of organization, the faith contributed to major slave revolts in the U.S. Gabriel Prosser in Richmond, Virginia, Denmark Vesey in Charleston, South Carolina, Nat Turner, who's actually an ancestor of mine, in Southern Virginia. And too often, leadership for abolition and for civil rights came out of the African American church in particular, but also in the greater church in the U.S. as well. What does this all mean for me, my story? I am a product of all of that mess, all of that history, and I was operating in paradigms that were holding me back from the fullness of the gospel expression that I'm supposed to make in this world. I was raised a Baptist, African-American denominations, Baptist, one of those factions, where the emphasis on overcoming this world, the injustice of slavery, discrimination, and segregation, was the focus almost to the exclusivity of anything else. And this coupled with the futuristic viewpoint of the end times. Remember, everything is focused on Judgment Day. That's where we'll get justice, and so we're just trying to endure this life because Jesus will take care of everything in the end. That didn't give me any kind of missiological viewpoint. No real development of a heart for the lost, to do the very thing that Jesus asked us to do, which was to go and make disciples of nations. My denominational viewpoints were a little unusual from your average African American because I was born in a family that actually embraced a lot of the denominations. I went to a Catholic high school, and there were members of my church who had issues about that with my dad. I remember those conversations. And then I remember wanting my church to host a Seder meal just to understand Passover and Easter much better, and it was like I was asking them to sacrifice chickens or something. So I started to realize then, bump up against the tensions that are within Christianity in particular around certain subject matters. But my move westward, where the landscape of church for me changed dramatically, was pivotal, and it was divinely ordained. He sent me out here and sent me to a multicultural church against my objections and my will. I wanted to be somewhere where I was known, loved, understood, and immediately accepted. 6 days a week I'm integrating. Sunday mornings is where I got filled up in a safe place and was sent out again. And he had to cut through all of that madness and just say to me, Nicole, there is no black side or white side of heaven. So you need to start living that way now because that's where you're headed. And put me into streams of ministry, church and parachurch ministries where I truly learned how to meet people where they are and figure out what are the common grounds and build relationship from there. Waiting for them to give me permission to tell them my story while listening to their stories on a regular basis. And the Father really wanted to set me on his quest of restoration, of what he means by that word, because we really don't understand half the words in the Bible that we use. We have a worldly viewpoint of those words instead of a biblical one. And that was the call to stand in the gap of disunity. Be willing to be uncomfortable, rejected, misunderstood, for the sake of the gospel, because that is really why we're here. That's where love truly begins. While we were yet enemies, he loved us. And that's our example too. That's what we're called to do too. So he set me on a path that I'm so glad he did, and I just hope others also join the call. Because if we can't do it, the world can't. If we can't unify, the world won't. Thank you.
We Mass Media, media empowering community.